He asked an alien widow for work. She said, "I need a father for my children, not a worker." Ethan Harper had never felt more out of place than he did on the planet Zerath. The city sprawled out in every direction, a labyrinth of towering buildings and crowded streets, its busy markets filled with sounds and smells that were alien to him. The neon signs flickered overhead in languages he could barely read, and the crowds rushed past him without a second glance. It had been nearly a month since his trade ship had crashed on the planet, and still, he found himself struggling to find a way back home. After the crash, he had been stranded in the city with no means of contacting Earth. The planet was technologically advanced, but its people, the Zerathians, weren't exactly welcoming to outsiders. The Zerathian government had offered him a small amount of aid, but it was clear they weren't particularly interested in helping him get back to Earth. He had no choice but to find work, and that meant navigating a new world with rules he didn't understand. The job market was tough, especially for humans. Ethan was a skilled mechanic and engineer, but the Zerathian workforce didn't seem to have a need for his skills. He had walked the streets, visiting countless businesses in search of work, but all his efforts had been in vain. The alien customs and complicated bureaucracy made it nearly impossible to find a job that would cover his living expenses. One evening, after another day of fruitless searching, Ethan wandered through the city's outer districts. The farther from the city center he went, the quieter and more desolate the streets became. He had heard rumors about a job opening for someone willing to do manual labor, and he hoped it might be his last chance. He followed the directions he'd been given, eventually reaching a small residential area on the outskirts of the city. The house he found was humble, built from strange materials that Ethan didn't recognize. The structure was low and sturdy, its windows dark with the fading light of dusk. A few small plants grew around the exterior, but the place had a quiet, almost abandoned feel to it. Ethan hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was really the right place. The job listing had said that the woman who lived here, Lyra, was in need of help, but the details had been vague. As he stepped up to the door, he knocked gently. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a woman with pale, smooth skin and long black hair. Her eyes were a deep shade of blue, almost unnatural in their intensity, and she looked at him with a kind of curiosity that made him feel both welcome and slightly out of place. "You must be Ethan," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Come in, I was expecting you." Ethan was taken aback by how quickly she had known who he was, but he didn't question it. He stepped inside and found himself in a small, cozy space. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with strange, foreign volumes, and the air smelled faintly of incense and something sweet. The lighting was soft, casting a warm glow across the room. "I'm Lyra," the woman said, offering him a seat on a low couch. "Please make yourself comfortable." Ethan sat, still unsure of what to expect. Lyra didn't seem to be in a hurry to discuss business, and instead, she watched him for a few moments in silence. It was a bit unnerving, but he had learned to deal with awkward moments during his travels. Finally, she spoke again. "You're here about the work, yes?" she asked, her voice almost too calm. "Yeah," Ethan replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm looking for something, well, anything that'll help me get by. I'm a mechanic, but I can do other kinds of labor if needed." Lyra's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to soften. "I don't need a mechanic," she said quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "What I need is something more than that." Ethan furrowed his brow, not entirely sure what she meant. "I don't follow." Lyra took a deep breath, sitting down across from him. "I'm not looking for someone to fix machines or perform labor. I need someone for my children." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Ethan was speechless. Children? He had assumed the job was a simple work contract, not some kind of family arrangement. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lyra raised her hand to stop him. "I understand this is unexpected," she continued. "But you're here for a reason, Ethan. I can see it in your eyes. You've been abandoned, haven't you?" Ethan felt a jolt in his chest. It wasn't something he often thought about, his isolation, his separation from Earth, but hearing it out loud made it feel real again. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "Yeah, something like that." Lyra leaned forward slightly. "I need a father for my children." Not a worker, not a laborer, a father. Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. "A father," she nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I lost my husband. He was important to the Zerathian military. His death left my children without the guidance they need." I've been raising them alone, but I cannot teach them everything they need to know. Not alone. Ethan's mind raced. He had no idea how to respond to this. What kind of arrangement was this? He had never been a father before, and the thought of becoming one to alien children was overwhelming. "Why me?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why a human?" Lyra sighed softly. "I have no family here. My husband's people, they don't help. And the Zorathian way is different. I think you would offer something my children need, something I cannot give them." Ethan sat back in his seat, trying to process everything she had just said. This wasn't just a job offer, it was something far more personal, far more complicated. But as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he saw a vulnerability that he couldn't ignore. She wasn't asking him for something casual. She was asking for help, for a kind of help that only someone like him could give. "I don't know what to say," he muttered, rubbing his face in frustration. "I'm just trying to survive here. I'm not exactly father material." Lyra smiled gently, her expression softening. "I know it's a lot to ask. I wouldn't do this if I didn't believe you were the right person for the job. If you choose to help, it won't be easy, but you'll never be alone in it." Ethan hesitated, still unsure. He had come to Zerath thinking that all he needed was work. A place to stay, some kind of routine to keep him occupied until he could figure out how to get home. But now, faced with this unexpected request, he found himself questioning everything. "I'll think about it," he said finally, standing up. "This is a big decision." Lyra nodded, standing with him. "Of course, I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Take your time. But know this, the offer will still stand. And when you're ready, my children will be waiting." Ethan left her home that evening, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He hadn't expected to be faced with such an impossible decision. He hadn't expected to meet a widow and her children who needed him, not just for work, but for something deeper. He wandered the city streets long into the night, unsure of what to do next. The stars above Zerath seemed so far away, like distant reminders of a life he could no longer reach. But as he thought about Lyra's children, her offer to him, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a purpose on this strange planet after all. The next few days were a blur for Ethan. He tried to focus on finding work, but his mind kept drifting back to Lyra and her children. He couldn't shake the thought of what she had asked of him, a father. He kept playing the words over and over in his head. He had no experience as a father, let alone to alien children. The thought seemed almost absurd, yet somehow he knew that Lyra wasn't just making a passing request. She was desperate, and there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't asking lightly. He spent the next morning wandering through the busy streets of Zerath, hoping the city would offer a distraction. He stopped by the market, where merchants were selling strange fruits and spices, some of which he could barely identify. The air was thick with the buzz of conversation, the clink of coins, and the shuffling of feet. But it all felt distant. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the pull of Lyra's words. By midday, Ethan found himself standing in front of her home once again. He hadn't planned on returning so soon, but here he was, his feet carrying him down the path to her door. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. He took a deep breath and knocked. Lyra opened the door almost immediately. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and relief, as if she had been waiting for him to come back. Her eyes softened when she saw him standing there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I've thought about what you said," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm not sure I can do what you're asking. I've never been a father. I don't know anything about raising children, let alone alien ones." Lyra nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. "I understand. It's not an easy request. It's not a job, it's a responsibility. And it's one I cannot take on alone." Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure of what to say next. "But I don't know anything about Zorathian culture. I don't know how to take care of your kids, how to guide them in a way that would make sense to them." Lyra's lips curved into a small smile. "That's exactly why I asked you. You're not supposed to know. That's why I need you here to teach them something they've never known." She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Please, come inside. We can talk more." Ethan hesitated, then stepped over the threshold into the warm interior of her home. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated the walls, and he could hear the faint sound of children's laughter coming from another room. He followed Lyra down the narrow hallway into the living area, where her two children, Rael and Alara, were playing. Rael was the older of the two, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with sharp features that gave him an intense look. He was sitting on the floor, building something from small metallic pieces. Ilara, who was younger, maybe 6, was watching him with wide, curious eyes. She had the same dark hair as her mother, but her eyes were a bright, almost unnatural green. When they saw Ethan, both children stopped what they were doing and stared at him. Ethan felt a strange sensation in his chest. The children didn't look scared, but they didn't seem overly welcoming either. They were curious, cautious even, as if they didn't know what to make of him. Lyra noticed the tension in the room and smiled gently. "This is Ethan," she said softly. "He's here to help us." Rael looked up at Ethan, his eyes narrow and calculating. He didn't say anything at first, just watched him with the intensity of someone who was trying to figure out the stranger in their midst. Ilara, on the other hand, seemed a little more open. She tilted her head to one side and smiled, a small, innocent smile that made Ethan feel slightly more at ease. "Help us with what?" Rael finally asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "What kind of help?" Ethan took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. "I'm here to help you, to teach you," he said, trying to sound confident. "I know I'm not from this planet and I don't know your ways, but I've lived a lot of places, seen a lot of things. I think I can help." Lyra stepped forward and placed a hand on Rael's shoulder. "He's not like the others," she said, her voice gentle. "He's here because I believe he can offer something that we need." The children were quiet for a moment. Then Rael spoke again, his voice sharp. "I don't need him," he said. "I don't need a stranger." Ethan felt a pang of disappointment, but he didn't let it show. It was clear that winning Rael over wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't going to give up. "I get it," Ethan said softly. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm just here to help. I know it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm willing to try, and I hope you'll give me a chance." Rael said nothing, but Ilara smiled again, her green eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Can you tell me stories?" she asked. "I like stories." Ethan smiled, relieved by her question. "Sure, I can tell stories," he said. "I've got plenty of them. Some of them are pretty wild, though." Lyra watched the exchange quietly, her expression unreadable. It was clear that the children were still uncertain, especially Rael, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. She had put everything into this, trusting that Ethan could be the person her children needed. She couldn't do it alone anymore. After a long silence, Lyra spoke. "I'll leave you to get acquainted," she said quietly. "But remember, Ethan, this is a long-term commitment. You're not just helping with their education, you're helping with their hearts." Ethan nodded, though the weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. As she walked away, leaving him alone with the children, he turned to Rael and Ilara. They were still watching him, unsure of what to make of him. "I guess we'll start slow," Ethan said, trying to keep things light. "How about a story? I'll start with one from Earth." "You've probably never heard of it." Rael didn't answer, but Ilara sat down on the floor in front of him, waiting for him to begin. Ethan took a seat on the couch and started with a simple tale from his childhood. It was a story of a brave explorer, someone who faced impossible odds and never gave up. As he spoke, he tried to imagine what it would be like for these two alien children to hear a human story, to understand the lessons he had learned growing up. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't just here to tell stories, he was here to become part of their lives. The next few weeks were harder than Ethan could have ever imagined. The children, Rael and Ilara, were not exactly what he had expected. He had thought that once he agreed to help, things would gradually fall into place, that they would quickly warm up to him. But it wasn't that simple. Rael, especially, was a challenge. The boy had a strong will and a sharp mind. He was clever, yes, but he was also stubborn, and it became clear very quickly that he didn't want a human in his life, let alone as a father figure. Every lesson Ethan tried to impart was met with resistance. Rael would question everything, asking why things had to be done the human way. He didn't see the value in anything Ethan tried to teach, whether it was the simple lessons of kindness or the practical lessons of how to fix things around the house. Ethan understood why. The boy had lost his father, a man he probably idolized, and now this stranger, this human, was stepping in to take his place. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow, no matter how well-intentioned Ethan was. Ilara, on the other hand, was easier to be around. She was curious, innocent, and had a natural openness that made it easier for Ethan to connect with her. She'd sit with him for hours, listening to his stories of Earth, asking endless questions about life on his planet. She didn't understand everything, but she tried. But there was still a barrier. Ethan was a human, and they were Zarathians. There were things about their culture that he could never understand, and that made it difficult to know how to raise these children properly. He couldn't just teach them the way a human parent would teach their children. It wasn't that simple. One evening, after another difficult day where Rael had stormed off in frustration after a failed lesson, Ethan sat down with Lyra. She was working at a table near the window, sorting through papers that looked like they were from an old Zarathian military archive. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice soft. She'd seen the way Ethan was struggling. She knew he felt like an outsider in their world and that the children were making it harder. "I know," Ethan said, rubbing his eyes. He was tired physically, emotionally, and mentally. "But I just don't know how to get through to them, especially Rael. He doesn't want me here, he doesn't trust me." Lyra looked up from her papers and studied Ethan's face. "Rael has always been the hardest. He's not like Alara, he's more like his father, proud, strong-willed. He doesn't easily accept change." Ethan nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The boy reminded him so much of his younger self. When he'd been a kid, he had never wanted anyone to step in and tell him what to do, especially not someone he didn't know. He could relate to Rael's stubbornness. But that didn't make it any easier to handle. "I'm just not sure if I can do this," Ethan admitted. "I mean, it's a lot to ask. It's not just about teaching them things they don't know. It's about becoming someone they need, someone they can rely on." Lyra set down the papers and came over to him. "You're not here to replace their father. You're not here to be perfect. You're here because they need someone. They need a human perspective, someone who can offer them a different view of the world, a different kind of strength." Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. What did Lyra mean by a different kind of strength? He hadn't been able to show them any strength in the way they understood it. But he did know how to persevere, how to keep pushing forward, even when everything seemed hopeless. Maybe that was the kind of strength they needed. That night, after Lyra had gone to bed, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the small living room. He looked over at the shelves filled with books, Zarathian literature, all of it in an alien language he couldn't read. He reached for one of the books, not knowing what it was about, but feeling like he needed something to distract him. As he flipped through the pages, the words on the pages swirled in front of his eyes, meaningless symbols that might as well have been from another universe. But in that moment, he realized something. He was more than just a stranger to these children. He was a bridge. A bridge between his world and theirs. A bridge between their past and their future. If he could just show them that there was value in seeing things from another perspective. If he could just show them that human strength wasn't about being the strongest or the toughest, but about caring, about standing by someone even when things got hard. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. The next day, Ethan decided to try a new approach. He woke up early, as usual, but instead of starting with lessons, he decided to spend the day with the children. No expectations, no lessons, just time spent together. Rael was the first to react. Ethan had gone to the workroom, hoping the boy would join him. Rael didn't come right away, and Ethan had begun to think the boy wasn't interested when, to his surprise, Rael appeared at the door. "I need you to help me with this," Rael said, holding up a broken piece of machinery. Ethan recognized it instantly. It was part of a Zarathian tool, something he could easily repair. Ethan didn't ask questions, he just nodded. "Sure, let's see what we can do." Together, they spent the morning fixing the machine. There were moments when Rael seemed frustrated, but instead of getting upset or angry, Ethan simply offered a steady, calm presence. They worked together, side by side, in silence for the most part. The task was simple, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he and Rael were making a real connection. Not through words, but through action. Rael wasn't ready to accept him as a father, but in that moment they were working as partners. Alara joined them later, her curiosity taking over as she watched Ethan and Rael fix the machine. She asked questions, but instead of the usual barrage of alien inquiries, her questions seemed softer, more personal. She wanted to understand the process, not just the facts. She wanted to learn. It was a small breakthrough, but for Ethan, it was a sign. Maybe he wasn't getting through to Rael the way he had hoped, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe, for now, the best he could do was to be there, be steady, be present, and show the children that he cared. That he was willing to stay, no matter how difficult things got. Over the next few days, Ethan continued to spend time with the children. Slowly, Rail began to open up, little by little. He didn't always talk about his feelings, but he started to seek Ethan's help with the smaller tasks, asking for advice on how to fix things around the house or how to make certain machines work. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Ilara, on the other hand, seemed to warm to Ethan more quickly. She asked him to tell her more stories, and sometimes they would sit together, talking about Earth and Zerath, comparing the two worlds in ways that made them both laugh. It was still difficult. There were days when Ethan wanted to give up, when the weight of the situation felt too heavy. But he reminded himself of Lyra's words. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about being the best father or the best teacher. It was about showing up. It was about caring. And slowly, he was beginning to realize that maybe that was all they needed. Weeks passed, and the life Ethan had slowly started to build with Lyra and her children felt more like a real family with each passing day. The mornings were no longer filled with tension. Instead, there was a rhythm to the days. The soft sounds of children's laughter, the hum of machines being repaired, the quiet conversations shared over simple meals. The bond between Ethan and the children was growing stronger. Rael, though still reserved, had started to show respect, even trust for him. Ilara had warmed to him completely, her curiosity and innocent nature making her easy to bond with. But as always, peace was fragile. One evening, as Ethan was finishing up a repair on a broken air filtration unit, Lyra came to him, her face unusually serious. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and followed her to the living room. Lyra looked troubled, her usually composed demeanor replaced with a mix of concern and worry. As they sat down, she spoke in a low voice as if afraid to be overheard. "There's someone coming," she said. "A man named Razek. He used to be an ally of my husband, well, more like a rival. He's powerful, dangerous. He's been looking for me ever since my husband's death." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Who is he?" "Razek was a high-ranking military leader in the Zerathian army," Lyra explained. "He's ambitious, ruthless, and he's not fond of humans. When my husband died, he saw it as an opportunity to claim power. He wanted me to join him to be his ally, but I refused. Now he wants to control this entire region, and he believes I am the key." Ethan's stomach tightened. He could see where this was going. "What does he want with you?" Lyra hesitated. "I'm the last of a powerful family line. My husband's death left my children vulnerable. Razek believes that if he can control me, he can control the children. He's coming to force me to marry him, to bind our families together. If I refuse, he won't hesitate to use violence." Ethan's mind raced. The thought of this ruthless man coming for them, coming for the children, made his blood run cold. He had already grown attached to Rael and Ilara. He couldn't let that happen. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the panic he was starting to feel. Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I need your help. I don't want to go down without a fight. I need you to protect us, protect the children. You're the only one who can help." Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't allow anyone to hurt Lyra or her children. They had already become a part of his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. He would fight even if it meant risking his own life. "All right," he said, clenching his fists. "We'll protect them. We'll make sure they're safe." Lyra nodded. "I'll send a message to my contacts, but we don't have much time. Razek is ruthless. His men are coming for us. We'll have to fight back before he gets here." Ethan stood, looking out the window. He could already feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The peaceful days they had shared were about to be shattered by violence. But he was ready. He had no other choice. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Lyra's home, small and unassuming, was anything but secure. They had to make it defensible and fast. Ethan worked tirelessly, using his knowledge of Earth-based tactics and technologies to reinforce the building. He set up makeshift barricades, hid weapons, and ensured that the escape routes were clear. Lyra helped where she could, but she was more focused on sending messages to her contacts, old allies, people who might be able to help. Rael and Ilara, both too young to fully understand the danger, did what they could. Rael, in particular, seemed to take the situation seriously. He helped Ethan with the barricades, though he didn't speak much. Ethan had noticed how the boy had changed over the weeks, becoming more responsible, more aware of the world around him. He wasn't the same angry, distrustful child he had been when Ethan first arrived. As the sun began to set, they took their positions. Ethan had instructed Lyra to stay inside with the children while he and Rael would keep watch. The night felt oppressive, the silence thick with tension. Every sound made Ethan's heart race. A twig snapping in the distant hum of the city, the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. And then in the distance he saw them, a group of men moving in the shadows. They were well-trained, coordinated. They were coming for them. Ethan motioned for Rael to follow him, and together they moved into position. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was sharp. He'd been in situations like this before, but never with so much at stake. These were Lyra's children. His children, in a way. He couldn't let anything happen to them. The men moved closer, their footsteps heavy. Ethan's instincts took over. He signaled to Rael, who nodded and crouched down, blending into the shadows. Ethan moved carefully, his eyes scanning the area, waiting for the right moment. The men finally appeared in the clearing near the house. Razek, a tall figure with cold, calculating eyes, was at the front. He wore the dark, imposing armor of a Zarathian officer, and his presence alone was enough to send a chill down Ethan's spine. Behind him were a handful of soldiers, armed and dangerous. Ethan held his breath, knowing that this was the moment. Razek looked up and saw the barricades, his lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can stop me?" he called out. "This is pointless. Surrender now, Lyra. Your resistance will only make things harder for you." Ethan felt Rael's hand on his shoulder. The boy's eyes were full of fear, but there was determination there too. Ethan put his finger to his lips, signaling Rael to stay quiet. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't going to happen, Razek." Razek laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "You, a human. You think you can stand against me? You're out of your league. This is my world, not yours." Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe you're right, but I'm not going to let you hurt these kids." The soldiers moved forward, but just as they reached the barricade, Ethan sprang into action. He grabbed the nearest soldier, twisting his arm and disarming him in one smooth motion. The fight erupted in an instant, and Ethan found himself in the middle of it, using everything he knew to protect Lyra's family. Rael was quick on his feet, moving silently and efficiently. He helped Ethan with one of the soldiers, taking him down with a swift strike. But Razek was a different kind of fighter. He moved with the confidence of someone who had fought and killed many times before. He wasn't just physically imposing, he was calculated. His eyes never left Ethan, a silent challenge between them. Ethan knew this wasn't over. They had to defeat Razek, not just for themselves, but for the future of Lyra's family. It was a battle that would decide everything. The air was thick with tension as the battle raged on. Ethan could hear the clang of weapons and the shouts of the soldiers, but his focus was entirely on Razek. The ruthless military leader had proven himself a worthy opponent, and Ethan knew that the outcome of this fight would decide everything. If they failed, Lyra and her children would be at his mercy. But if they succeeded, they could keep their home, their lives, and their family. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, but his movements were calm and deliberate. He had faced combat before, but this was different. This time there were lives at stake, Lyra's, Rael's, Ilara's. He couldn't let Razek's cruelty win. Not now, not after everything they had been through. Rael moved beside him, showing a level of maturity that Ethan hadn't seen in him before. The boy's face was set in determination as he fought alongside him, dispatching one of the soldiers with a swift strike to the chest. Ethan could see the fear in his eyes, but it was mixed with something else, a courage he hadn't expected. Rael was learning. He was growing into the protector he had once refused to be. Ilara, who had stayed inside the house at Lyra's insistence, was too young to understand the full danger of the situation, but Ethan knew she was safe. Lyra was watching over her, making sure they stayed hidden in the back room, away from the chaos. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had worked for, the peaceful life they had begun to build, was hanging in the balance. Razek, standing at the center of the fight, seemed unfazed by the chaos around him. His soldiers were skilled, but it was clear that their leader was the real threat. He was fast, brutal, and calculating. Every time Ethan made a move, Razek countered it with precision, pushing Ethan back further. "You're not a warrior, human," Razek sneered, his voice cold. "You don't belong here. This planet is not your home. You're just a temporary distraction, a flea on a Zarathian's back." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for everything he had come to care about. He wasn't going to let this man destroy the life they had made together. "Maybe I'm not a warrior, Razek," Ethan called back, ducking under a swift blow and countering with a punch to the soldier's midsection. But I know what it means to fight for something worth protecting, and that's why I'm not giving up. Razek's eyes narrowed, his expression turning darker. You think you can stop me? You're nothing. And these children, they don't need you. They need someone strong, someone who understands Zerath. Then why are you afraid of me? Ethan shot back, a grin forming despite the tension. You can't even defeat a human. You really think you can rule over Lyra and her children? The words hit their mark. Razek's anger flared, and he lunged at Ethan with a ferocity that made the ground beneath them shake. But Ethan was ready. He stepped aside at the last moment, using the momentum of Razek's attack to send him crashing into one of his own soldiers. It was a small victory, but it was enough to tip the balance. Razek's soldiers were starting to falter. The fear they had been holding back was creeping into their eyes. They had underestimated the human. They had underestimated the bond between Ethan and the family he had come to protect. Rael, seeing an opportunity, grabbed a fallen weapon, a long, serrated knife, and rushed in to help. He moved with speed and precision, targeting the weaker soldiers, his strikes calculated and effective. Ethan had seen the boy grow over the past few weeks, but never had he seen him like this. Rael wasn't just fighting anymore. He was defending. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. In that moment, Ethan realized that the child who had once rejected him was now standing side by side with him in battle. He was no longer just a child. He was a protector, a warrior in his own right. Razek recovered from the collision and stood up, his eyes blazing with fury. You're all fools, he spat, drawing his weapon. It was a long, jagged blade, almost like a spear, and its sharp edge glowed with a menacing light. He was no longer holding back. Ethan's body tensed as Razek advanced, his weapon raised high. But this time Ethan wasn't afraid. He had something to protect. He had a reason to fight. He raised his own weapon, an improvised spear, and prepared to face Razek head-on. The two men clashed with a force that shook the ground. Sparks flew as their weapons met, and the sound of metal on metal echoed in the night. Ethan's arms ached with each strike, but he refused to back down. This was his fight now. The life of the family he had come to love was in his hands. Razek pressed forward, his strength and skill undeniable, but Ethan fought back with everything he had. He wasn't just using physical strength, he was using everything he had learned in the past weeks. He was using the bond he had formed with Lyra and her children, the lessons he had taught them, the courage he had seen in them. He wasn't fighting alone. He had a family now. Finally, with a decisive move, Ethan managed to disarm Razek. The blade flew from his grasp, and Razek staggered back, breathing heavily, his face twisted in rage. But it was too late. His soldiers had already begun to retreat, their morale shattered by the unexpected resilience of the human and the children. The leader of the Zerathian force had failed. Razek's eyes were filled with venom as he glared at Ethan. This isn't over, he spat, his voice low and dangerous. You may have won today, human, but this isn't the end. There will be others who come for you. Ethan stood his ground, his weapon still raised. If they want to fight, they'll get one, but you're done here. With that, Razek turned and retreated, his remaining soldiers following in his wake. The battle was over. The immediate danger had passed. Ethan stood there, panting and covered in sweat, his body aching from the fight. He turned to see Rael and Alara standing nearby, their faces filled with awe. Rael was holding his knife tightly, still ready for anything, but Alara had her arms wrapped around Lyra, who had come outside during the final moments of the battle. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes searching Ethan's face. You did it, she whispered. You saved us. Ethan nodded, his voice hoarse. We did it, all of us. Rael stepped forward, his eyes no longer filled with defiance but with something softer, respect. You really are a warrior, he said, his voice steady. Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. I'm not a warrior, Rael. I'm just a man who wants to protect the people he cares about. Lyra walked up to him, placing a hand on his arm. And that's what makes you a warrior. In the days that followed, life began to return to some sense of normalcy. The threat of Razek was gone and the family was safe once more. But things had changed. The bond between Ethan and Lyra's children was stronger than ever. Rael had begun to see him not just as a guardian, but as a father, a protector. And Alara, with her innocent smile, had started to call him Dad. Ethan realized that this wasn't just a temporary situation. This was his life now. The family he had never expected, the family he had come to love, had become his own, and he would protect them no matter what.